Close your eyes for just a moment. Imagine you are standing in the middle of a massive, roaring airport. Planes are thundering overhead. Thousands of people are rushing past you, strangers with suitcases, children crying, announcements blaring through the speakers. Everyone is going somewhere. Everyone has someone waiting for them on the other side. Now imagine you are not a person. Imagine you are a dog. You don't understand departure gates. You don't understand international borders. You don't understand paperwork or bureaucracy or the cold logic of rules that say you cannot board a plane because one small document is missing. All you understand is this. The person you love more than anything in this world walked away from you today. He was right here. You could smell him. You could feel him. And then he was gone. So you wait. You wait because what else is there to do? You wait because every fiber of your being tells you he is coming back. You wait because the love inside you is too large, too powerful, too absolute to simply switch off. Because a human made a decision you cannot understand. You wait in the freezing cold. You wait in the pouring rain. You wait when your stomach is empty and your paws are sore and the world is dark and indifferent around you. You wait because for you, loyalty is not a choice. It is the only language you know. This is not a fairy tale. This is not something someone made up to make you cry. This happened in real life. In the Soviet Union in 1974, at a real airport on the outskirts of Moscow, a real German shepherd named Palma was abandoned by her owner, and what she did next became one of the most heartbreaking, awe-inspiring, and profoundly human stories ever told. Except it wasn't a human who lived it. It was a dog. And every single person who crossed her path was never quite the same again. What you are about to hear is the full story. Every detail, every twist, every heartbreak, every moment of unexpected grace. Some of it will make you angry. Some of it will make you cry. And if you have a heart, even a small, guarded, closed-off one, some of it will crack you wide open. So settle in, because this is the kind of story the world doesn't tell you enough. The kind of story that reminds you what love actually looks like when it has no agenda, no conditions, no expiry date. This is the story of Palma. It was the kind of morning that Moscow does better than anywhere else in the world, gray and cold and heavy, with the smell of jet fuel and frost. The year was 1974. The Soviet Union was at the height of its power, a vast, complicated empire held together by ideology and iron will. But inside Vnukovo International Airport on the southwestern edge of Moscow, the mood was ordinary, bureaucratic, routine. Passengers shuffled through the terminal in thick winter coats. Families said goodbye. Workers moved with the mechanical efficiency of people who had done the same job 1,000 times. At the gates, flight attendants in crisp Aeroflot uniforms checked documents with the kind of stern authority that left no room for negotiation. Among the passengers that morning was a man. We don't know his full name. History, in its selective way, has not preserved it for us. Perhaps because what he did that day is not the kind of thing anyone wants to be remembered for. What we do know is that he was leaving Moscow. He had a new assignment, a new life waiting for him in another city far away, cold, remote in the north of the country. A place called Norilsk, one of the most isolated industrial cities in the Soviet Union, built above the Arctic Circle where temperatures dropped to unimaginable lows and the winters lasted for months on end. He was taking everything with him, his luggage, his papers, his plans. And he had brought his dog. Palma was a purebred German shepherd, young, strong, beautiful, with the kind of deep, intelligent eyes that seemed to look right through you. She had the classic markings of her breed, a rich, dark coat across her back that faded into warm tan along her legs and face, ears that stood perfectly upright, and a presence that commanded attention without demanding it. She walked beside her owner with absolute confidence, not because she was arrogant, but because she had never had any reason to doubt that her place in the world was right next to him. She trusted him completely. Dogs like Palma always do. The problem began at the gate. In the Soviet Union, traveling with an animal required specific documentation, a veterinary certificate that proved the animal had been examined, vaccinated, and cleared for travel. Without this certificate, no airline would allow an animal on board. It was a firm rule enforced without exception. The man reached into his coat, into his bag, threw his papers, and the certificate was not there. Perhaps he had forgotten it. Perhaps he had never obtained it in the first place, assuming he could talk his way through the checkpoint. Perhaps he had lost it somewhere in the chaos of preparing for a major move. We don't know. What we do know is that when he presented himself at the gate with Palma at his side, the flight attendant looked at him, looked at the dog, and asked for the veterinary certificate. He didn't have it. The conversation that followed was heated. Witnesses at the airport later recalled seeing the man argue with the airline staff, his voice rising with frustration, his hands gesturing toward Palma as if pleading a case that should have been obvious. The dog was healthy. She was well behaved. Surely an exception could be made. Surely the system had some flexibility. It did not. In the Soviet Union, rules were rules. The flight attendant was unmoved. Without the certificate, the dog could not board. The matter was closed. The man stood there for a long moment. His flight was boarding. The clock was against him. He had a job waiting, a life to begin, obligations that could not be postponed. And he had a dog he could not take with him. What happened next is something that people who witnessed it struggled to explain for years afterward. Because what the man did when faced with an impossible situation, when given a choice between his dog and his plans, was not what you would hope a person would do. He walked back to Palma. He knelt down in front of her. He looked at her one last time, and then he reached down and unclipped her leash. Palma, feeling the sudden freedom, did what any dog would do. She shook herself, looked around, and began to trot along the edge of the runway, happy, curious, thinking this was some kind of new game. She didn't understand. How could she? He was still right there. She could see him. She glanced back at him with that open, joyful expression that dogs wear when they are simply glad to be alive and near the person they love. She didn't see him walk away. She didn't see him move toward the boarding stairs, join the line of passengers, and disappear through the door of the Ilyushin Il-18, the four-engine turboprop that would carry him north, away from Moscow, away from her. She heard the engines grow louder. She turned to look. The plane was moving, and the man who had been her entire world was gone. Palma ran to the edge of the tarmac. She sniffed the air. She paced back and forth. She waited for him to come back, because surely he was coming back. This was a mistake, a misunderstanding. He would return in a moment, and they would leave together, and everything would be fine. An hour passed. The tarmac emptied. The planes came and went. The noise of the airport continued its relentless rhythm. He did not come back. And so Palma did the only thing her heart told her to do. She stayed. The first few days must have been bewildering for her. The airport was a vast, confusing place, full of strange smells, unpredictable machinery, and hundreds of humans who were all in a hurry and had no interest in a stray dog wandering near the runways. Airport security noticed her almost immediately and made several attempts to capture her. She was fast, wary, and deeply intelligent, slipping away from every attempt to corner her, finding hiding places among the equipment sheds and cargo areas, learning the rhythms and routines of the airport the way a survivor learns the rhythms of a hostile environment. She did not trust anyone. Not yet. Not humans who reached for her collar or called to her in coaxing voices. She had trusted one human completely, and he had left her alone in the most bewildering place she had ever been. The lesson had been brutal, even if she lacked the language to articulate it. But she stayed. And every day, with a regularity that began to astonish the airport workers, Palma appeared near the runway when the Ilyushin Il-18 flights were arriving. She would stand at the edge of the tarmac, alert, focused, body tense with anticipation, and watch each plane as it taxied in. She watched the passengers disembark. She scanned every face, every figure, every movement with those brilliant amber eyes. She was looking for him. The airport staff began to notice. At first, it was just a curiosity, a stray dog that kept appearing near the runways, that somehow always knew when certain planes were landing, that seemed impervious to both capture and cold. Some found it amusing. Some found it a nuisance. A few watching her stand in the freezing wind night after night, her eyes fixed on the distant runway lights with an expression of absolute, unshakable hope, found it almost unbearable to witness. Because everyone who watched Palma understood what they were seeing. You didn't need to speak dog. You didn't need any special knowledge of animal behavior or psychology. You could look at this German shepherd standing in the snow, watching every plane that landed, and understand in your bones what she was doing. She was waiting for the one person who meant everything to her. And he was not coming. As weeks turned into months, a strange thing happened. The airport workers, the mechanics, the technicians, the ground crew, the people who worked in the shadows of the terminal and rarely appeared in photographs or official records, began to take care of her. Not openly at first. Not officially. Because officially, a stray dog could not live at Vnukovo International Airport. There were health regulations. There were safety concerns. There were rules. But unofficially, quietly, with the kind of tender conspiracy that ordinary people engage in when they see something that breaks their heart, the workers of Vnukovo began to make sure Palma survived. Food appeared near her favorite resting spots, scraps from the canteen, bones wrapped in newspaper, bowls of water that were refreshed even in temperatures that froze everything solid. When the weather turned truly brutal, someone always seemed to find a way to leave a door slightly open, to ensure there was a warm corner somewhere where a dog could sleep without freezing. They tried to give her a name. She wouldn't respond to most of the things they called her. She was a trained, owned dog, and she had a name, though they didn't know what it was. They tried several options, calling out different names and watching her reactions. When someone tried Alma, she looked up, and so they settled on something close to that, eventually calling her Palma, a name that suited her, somehow regal, distinctive, a name for a dog who had earned her place in the world through sheer, stubborn faithfulness. But even as they fed her and sheltered her, even as she slowly, cautiously allowed certain workers to come close enough to touch her, Palma never stopped her vigil. Every day, without fail, regardless of weather or hour, she returned to her post near the runway when the Il-18 flights came in. Every day, she watched and waited and scanned the faces of the arriving passengers. Every day he was not among them. Time in Palma's world must have worked very differently than it does in ours. We know, because we are human, that the man who abandoned her was gone, that he had built a new life elsewhere, that he was not coming back, that Palma's wait was in vain. But Palma did not know this. She knew only that he had been here and now he was not, and that somehow the planes were connected to his absence. She had watched him board a plane. And so she watched every plane, because any one of them might bring him home. There is something almost impossible to sit with in that image. A dog who doesn't understand that her loyalty is unrequited. A dog who has no concept of betrayal, no capacity for bitterness, no mechanism by which she might protect herself from the grief of waiting for someone who will never come. She simply loved him, and she waited, and the love did not diminish with the waiting. If anything, it seemed only to grow more concentrated, more pure, more absolute with every passing month. The Soviet Union had its Hechiko. Except Palma's story was, in some ways, even more devastating than the famous Japanese dog's tale because Hachiko's owner had died. He had not chosen to leave. The heartbreak of Hachiko's story is profound, but it contains within it a kind of grace. The owner would have stayed if he could. He loved his dog. He simply had no power over death. Palma's owner had a choice, and he made it. It was during this long, ongoing vigil that Kolya arrived. Kolya was 9 years old, which meant he was at that precise, knife-edge age where childhood and awareness are fused together, in ways that can be overwhelming. He was old enough to understand that something terrible had happened, that his mother was gone, that the safe, warm center of his world had been removed. But he was young enough that this understanding arrived not as philosophy but as raw, physical pain. He missed his mother with every breath. He carried her absence like a weight he didn't yet have the muscles to bear. He had been sent to Moscow to live with his father, a pilot named Vyacheslav Lazarev, who worked out of Vnukovo International Airport. This was, in theory, a solution. Kolya needed a parent. His father was a parent. The mathematics seemed straightforward. The reality was more complicated. Vyacheslav was a good man in the way that many men of that era and that culture were good, dutiful, disciplined, capable, responsible in the large, official ways while being less skilled at the quieter, more intimate forms of care. He and Kolya were strangers, essentially. A father and son who barely knew each other, brought together by tragedy and geography, trying to build something out of nothing. For Kolya, arriving in this massive, gray, unfamiliar city, moving into a household, with a father who felt more like a formal acquaintance than a parent, attending a new school where he knew no one, the weight of loneliness was crushing. He was 9 years old and he felt completely, utterly alone. And then he found Palma, or maybe Palma found him, depending on how you look at it. Kolya had come to the airport one afternoon with his father. He was waiting in that bored, aimless way of children who have been brought to adult spaces with nothing to do, wandering the edges of the grounds, kicking at stones, watching the planes with the distracted interest of a boy who is trying to escape his own thoughts. That was when he saw her. She was standing at the edge of the tarmac, watching an incoming plane, with the focused intensity that had become her defining posture. She was thinner than she should have been, the sharp angles of her ribs visible even through her thick coat. Her paws were rough from months on the concrete and asphalt. But her bearing was still proud, still alert, still extraordinary. She looked like a dog who had decided that she would not be defeated, no matter what the world threw at her. Kolya stopped walking. He stared at her. Something about her, the solitude of her, the deliberate dignity of her, reached straight into the center of his chest and found the part of him that was most bruised. He recognized her. Not her specifically, he had never seen her before. But he recognized what she was. He recognized the posture of someone who was waiting for a person who wasn't coming back. He had been living in that posture himself for months. He knew every contour of it. He sat down on the ground, at a distance that he somehow understood was important. Not so far that it was a rejection, not so close that it was a demand. He just sat there in the cold, and he watched her, and she watched the planes. And for a few minutes, they were simply two creatures who were lonely in similar ways, existing in the same space. Eventually, Palma turned and looked at him. They regarded each other for a long moment. Her amber eyes were steady, measuring, ancient in their intelligence. His were dark and cautious and a little bit desperate, the eyes of a child who has been hurt, and is not quite sure whether it is safe to hope again. He reached into his coat pocket. He had a piece of bread from earlier, wrapped in paper, half forgotten, and he held it out toward her. Not throwing it, not placing it on the ground, holding it in his open palm and offering a gesture that said, "I see you, I am not a threat. I would like to be your friend if you will let me." Palma looked at the bread. She looked at the boy. She took one step toward him, then another. As she took the bread from his hand, it was, as these things go, one of the most important moments in both their lives, though neither of them could have known it at the time. After that day, Kolya came to the airport as often as he could. He brought food, saving scraps from meals, spending small amounts of his allowance on things he thought she might like. He learned her rhythms and her routines. He learned which workers would shoo him away and which ones would pretend not to notice him. Crouched behind the equipment shed, sharing a meal with a German shepherd who looked at him with something that felt, slowly and unmistakably, like trust. He learned about her vigil. One of the older technicians, a gruff, weathered man named Sergei, who had been at Vnukovo for more years than he could easily count, told Kolya the story. about the man and the plane and the missing certificate and the morning. Everything had changed. For Palma, he told it flatly, without sentimentality, the way people who have seen a great deal of the world sometimes protect themselves from feeling too much. But his voice, Kolya noticed, was slightly rough by the time he finished. And he didn't quite meet the boy's eyes. Kolya listened to the whole story and said nothing for a while. Then he said, "But he might still come back?" Sergei looked at the boy, looked at the dog, looked back at the boy. "She thinks so," he said. "Every day she thinks so." For Kolya, knowing this changed everything. Because now when he sat with Palma and watched the planes come in with her, he wasn't just keeping a lonely dog company. He was participating in something sacred, something that felt, to his 9-year-old heart, like the most important act of faith he had ever witnessed. She believed, against all evidence, against all probability, against everything the cold logic of the adult world said was rational and sensible. She believed that the one she loved was coming back. And Kolya, who had lost his mother and gained a stranger for a father and had no particular reason to believe that the world was a kind or trustworthy place, found that watching Palma believe made it slightly easier for him to believe things too. Not in the same thing, but in the general idea of it, in the possibility that love, when it is real and absolute, is worth something, is worth holding on to. The friendship between the boy and the dog became one of the worst kept secrets at Vnukovo Airport. The workers knew. Kolya's father knew, eventually, though Vacheslav's reaction was complicated, as most of his reactions to his sons seemed to be. There was something about this child, so fierce in his attachment to this abandoned animal, so determined in his quiet, stubborn loyalty, that both moved and unsettled him. Perhaps because Vacheslav understood, somewhere he did not like to look, that Kolya's devotion to Palma was also a kind of mirror. The boy who had been left alone was caring for the dog who had been left alone. And the parallel was not comfortable for a father who had, in his own way, also left. But the crisis, when it came, was official. And it was serious. The airport authorities eventually ran out of patience. A German shepherd running loose on the grounds of an international airport was, objectively, a problem. There were regulations. There were safety concerns. There were visiting officials and inspections, and the kind of institutional anxiety that accompanies any deviation from established procedure in a system that is built on procedure. An order came down, the dog had to go, animal control was called, a proper operation was organized. This time it would not be a half-hearted attempt by a couple of workers. This would be a coordinated effort with nets and vehicles and personnel and the full weight of official authority behind it. When Kolya found out, he was devastated in the particular way of children, completely, without reservation, without the adult instinct to manage or contain the feeling. He didn't argue or negotiate or make a rational case. He simply appeared at the airport and stood between Palma and the people who had come to take her away. It was, by any objective measure, an absurd thing to do. He was 9 years old. He weighed perhaps 30 kilograms. He had no official standing, no authority, no leverage of any kind. He was just a child who had decided that this was a line he would not allow to be crossed. And the airport workers, those gruff, pragmatic, seen-it-all men and women who had been quietly feeding and protecting Palma for months, found themselves, almost without deciding to, standing beside him. Not all of them, but enough. Sergei was there. Others were there. People who had watched this dog for all these months, who had seen her stand in the snow and watch the planes and never, ever give up. People who had been moved by her in ways they might not have been able to articulate but could not deny. The standoff was not dramatic in the way movies make these things dramatic. There was no shouting, no grand speeches, just a group of ordinary people and one small boy and one faithful dog making it quietly, plainly clear that they were not going to cooperate with the order that had been given. It worked, not permanently, not officially, but the immediate crisis passed. The animal control team left without Palma, The official machinery ground slowly, as official machinery tends to do. And in the grinding, time passed. And in the passing of time, things shifted. The story of Palma began to spread. The airport workers talked. Their families heard. Word traveled through the neighborhoods and communities around Vnukovo, the way stories travel in places where people are close enough to share them. A journalist named Yuri Rost eventually heard about the German shepherd who waited at the airport, and what he wrote would eventually reach millions of Soviet citizens in the pages of Komsomolskaya Pravda, one of the most widely read newspapers in the country. But that came later. For now, the story was still local, still intimate, still belonging mostly to the people who lived it. And Kolya was growing up. The months of being Palma's companion were doing something to him, something you could see if you looked. The rigid, defended posture of a grieving child was slowly loosening. He smiled more. He talked more. He had something to get up for in the mornings, somewhere to go, a creature who genuinely needed him and was genuinely glad to see him, who could not lie about either of those things because dogs cannot lie. The simple, daily reality of being loved by Palma was healing, something in Kolya that nothing else had been able to reach. And his father noticed. Vyacheslav Lazarev was a man whose emotions lived deep beneath the surface, who expressed care through action rather than words, who had spent years in the isolated discipline of a pilot's life and was not entirely sure how to be a father to a grieving child he barely knew. But he was not a stupid man, and he was not, ultimately, an unfeeling one. He watched his son with this dog. He watched the change in Kolya, and he began cautiously to understand something about what his son needed. He began to understand something about what he himself had failed to provide, and what Palma, simply by being herself, had given in his absence. There were conversations between father and son that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. Awkward, halting, imperfect conversations, but real ones. The kind that happen when two people have been softened enough by the same thing to finally be able to reach each other. Palma was the thing that softened them. She was, without intending to be, without even knowing she was doing it, the bridge between a father and a son who had been separated by more than geography. And then came the day that everyone had been dreading, and almost no one had allowed themselves to think about. The owner came back. He arrived at Vnukovo on an ordinary day, unremarkable except for what it contained. He had come back to Moscow, whether for good or temporarily. The historical record is not entirely clear, and he had come to the airport. Whether he expected Palma to still be there, whether he knew about her vigil, whether he felt anything approaching guilt or shame about what he had done, we don't know. We can only know what was witnessed. Palma was at her usual post near the runway when she smelled him, or heard him. Or perhaps there is some sense that dogs have for the specific human they love that we don't, have a name for something deeper than smell or hearing, a resonance in the blood. However it happened, she knew he was there before she could have logically known it. Her whole body changed. The alertness became something more electric, more primal. She lifted her nose. She turned. And then she saw him. What happened next is the part of the story that people who witnessed it could never quite describe without their voices failing. Palma ran. Not the controlled, watchful trot she used when approaching planes. A full, all-out run. The run of a creature who has been waiting for so long that the waiting has become its own kind of agony. And now the waiting is over, and every cell in the body is releasing that agony in a single, explosive movement toward the source of all love. She ran to him. She circled him. She pressed her body against his legs. She looked up at his face with those amber eyes that had watched and waited and hoped for so long. Her tail moved with a velocity that seemed barely contained by her body. She whimpered and she cried in the way that dogs cry when they are overwhelmed by a feeling they cannot express in any other way. She was so happy she could barely stand it. He was there. He had come back. Everything she had believed, everything she had waited for, was true, except it wasn't, not quite. because the man had not come back to take her home. He had come back, yes, but he had a new life, new circumstances, new reasons why he could not simply fold Palma back into his world as though the last 2 years had not happened. He stood there and let her greet him, and he was, by all accounts, not unmoved. He was not made of stone. He was a human being who had once loved this animal and who was now confronted with the physical, undeniable evidence of what she had endured for him. But he left again. What he said to her, or whether he said anything at all, we don't know. We only know that when it was over, when he had gone, Palma was still there. And something in her was different. She still came to the runway when the Il-18 flights landed. For a while, gradually, slowly in a way, that the workers who had watched her for so long could not quite pinpoint. The moment of, she seemed to let go of something. Not her loyalty, not her love, but perhaps the specific singular certainty that he was coming. Perhaps the hope shifted or loosened, or became something more like memory than anticipation. It is impossible to know what happens inside a dog's mind. But the workers at Vnukovo, those people who had known her longer than almost anyone, felt the change. They saw it in the way she carried herself, the way she greeted them, with more openness now, less held in reserve for the one who never came, as though some internal decision had been made, as though she had finally, in the deepest part of herself, allowed the airport and the people in it to be enough. It was Vyacheslav Lazarev who made the final decision. The pilot, Kolya's father, the man who had watched his son be transformed by a dog's love and had the sense and the grace to recognize what was being offered to all of them. He took Palma home, not as a temporary measure, not as a favor or an experiment. Permanently, officially, with paperwork and everything, he registered her as his dog, brought her to the apartment where he and Kolya lived, and closed the door of the airport chapter of her life. Kolya's reaction is one of those things you can imagine perfectly without needing to be told. The boy who had spent months being Palma's companion, who had fed her and defended her and sat with her in the freezing cold watching planes, that boy had a dog, his dog officially in his home, and the dog who had given him back his ability to hope and his ability to love had a family, an actual permanent family. The transformation in both of them, in all three of them, the boy and the dog and the slowly thawing pilot who had needed both of them to teach him something about what family actually means was, by all accounts, extraordinary. Palma lived. She thrived. She was at last home. Years later, when the journalist Yuri Rost published his article about the German shepherd who had waited at Vnukovo Airport for 2 years, the story spread across the Soviet Union. It became one of those stories that a culture holds on to because it touches something essential, something about loyalty and love, and the question of whether faithfulness has any meaning. In a world that is often faithless, letters poured into the newspaper from readers who had been moved. People wrote about their own dogs, their own experiences of loss and loyalty, the ways in which animals had given them something they could not find elsewhere. The story of Palma became, in the fullest sense of the word, a story that belonged to everyone. And decades later, filmmakers looked at what had happened at Vnukovo in 1974 and felt the same thing those readers had felt, that this story needed to be told fully, cinematically, in a way that would let people see and feel the whole of it. The film that emerged is quietly devastating in the way that true stories often are, because you cannot watch it and entirely dismiss it as entertainment. It carries the weight of something that actually happened, of a dog who actually stood in the snow, of a boy who actually sat beside her, of love that was actually this stubborn, this unyielding, this absolute. What does it mean to be faithful? What does it mean to love without condition, without strategy, without the self-protective mechanisms that we humans spend our whole lives constructing and maintaining? What does it mean to wait, not because you have been told to, not because you expect a reward, not because you have calculated that the odds justify it, but simply because love commands you to? Palma did not choose to wait in the way that we choose things. She did not make a rational decision and commit to it in the face of doubt. She simply was who she was, a dog who had given her whole heart to one person and who could not ungive it. Her faithfulness was not heroic in the human sense. It was something more elemental than heroism. It was just what she was. And that, perhaps, is the most devastating thing about her story. Not that she suffered, though she did. Not that she was betrayed, though she was. But that she never, for a single moment, stopped believing that love was worth it. She never became bitter. She never gave up. She stood in the snow and watched the plains and waited, with her whole body and her whole soul, for someone who had already decided she wasn't worth staying for. And in the end, it was that faithfulness, that absolute, uncomplicated, unstrategic love that saved her. Not because her owner came back. He didn't, not in the way she needed. But because her faithfulness moved the people around her, it reached into the hardened places in Sergei the technician, and the other airport, workers and a 9-year-old boy and a complicated pilot father, and it softened them. It reminded them of something they had half forgotten. It brought out in them the best version of themselves, the version that will stand between a faithful dog and the people who want to take her away, the version that will leave food out in the freezing cold, the version that will finally, when all the waiting is over, open a door and say, "Come home." That is what love does when it is real. It doesn't just exist for the one it's directed at. It radiates outward. It changes the air around it. It makes people better than they planned to be. Palma loved one man with everything she had, and he left her. But in staying, in refusing to stop loving and continuing to believe, in being every single day, the most faithful creature anyone at that airport had ever seen, she created a family. She gave a lonely boy a reason to hope again. She opened a closed man's heart. She built something out of nothing, the way only love can. She waited because she had to. She was loved in return because she was impossible not to love. And she came home because in the end, the world, even this cold and complicated world, has room in it for a dog who loves that purely. That is the story of Palma. And if you have a dog, if there is an animal in your life who greets you with that specific, overwhelming joy every single time you walk through the door, who loves you without keeping score, who would wait for you at the end of the world if you asked, maybe after hearing this, you will stop for just a moment before you go about your day. And you will look at them, really look, and you will understand fully what you are holding in your hands,